Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we have something a little different. We're taking a high-level vocabulary list and using it as a map.
A map, right? Not a dictionary.
Exactly. A map to the very complex layered realities of our globally mobile world. We are not just learning definitions today.
No, absolutely not. The mission here is to use this advanced language, what you'd call C2 proficiency language, as a kind of sophisticated lens.
A lens to see the hidden systems that govern how and why people move around the planet.
That's right. It's a challenging task, but it's a vital one. We're looking at 21 C2 level terms, all related to global tourism and migration, and we're using them as analytical anchors.
And C2 is the highest level of mastery, right? It's the point where you don't just know a word.
You know, it's context.
Yeah.
The very precise, often technical context that gives it its power. I mean, this is the language of academic journals, of policy briefs, of really high-stakes global conversations.
And global mobility.
Wow.
It's maybe the defining issue of our era. It's not just booking a ticket anymore.
Not at all. It's this massive logistical choreography. It's about economic consequences that ripple across continents. It's about humanitarian crises. And these really intricate legal frameworks that decide who gets to move and when and why.
Whether it's a choice, voluntary travel, or it's forced displacement, these words are what capture that nuance.
And we need that nuance. It's paramount. If we want to really get the difference between, say, a high-end luxury trip and a desperate flight from persecution, you need terms that force you to look beneath the surface.
Right. So we're moving beyond just saying, oh, the hotel is expensive.
Exactly. We're analyzing the rack rate. We're not just saying they were sent back. We're going to debate the legality of refoulement.
So we've broken this deep dive down. We have tourism nouns, migration nouns, and then a really critical set of verbs. And we promise we're going to give you the real-world applications and the deep insights to make these terms stick.
And really upgrade your ability to talk about these global themes.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so this abstract idea of movement, it needs physical anchors. So we're shifting our focus now to the tangible side of things, the infrastructure of global travel.
Part one. This is where efficiency meets and very often fails the human element.
And we have to start with a surprisingly simple noun, a noun of aviation and commerce, the luggage carousel. The great rotating wheel of weary anticipation. You're just staring endlessly, wondering if your bag actually made the connection.
That's it, exactly. The luggage carousel is that automated rotating conveyor system where your checked baggage is delivered. And its efficiency is just absolutely critical to how an airport functions.
And the word itself, carousel, where does that come from?
It's fascinating, actually. It derives from the French carousel, which was a kind of jousting game, but later it was used for amusement rides, and it evokes that same circular, almost endless motion.
So if the system is all about efficiency, how does it also become this microcosm of global drama?
Because it's a point of convergence. I mean, think about the stark contrast in the human stories that are playing out right there around that one piece of engineering.
Okay.
On one hand, you have the tourist experience. A family at JFK, maybe they're spotting their brand new oversized suitcases coming from Milan. It's a symbol of leisure, of shopping, of consumption.
Right.
But then you have the complete opposite scenario. A migrant worker, say, arriving in Manila after years away. And they're retrieving this worn, taped-up bag that has crucial earnings, medicine, gifts for their family. It's a symbol of sacrifice, of economic necessity.
Same circle, two completely different worlds.
Exactly.
So here's where a technical failure gives us a global insight. Our source material really went into the infamous 2022 summer chaos across European airports. Heathrow, Amsterdam.
It was a mess.
A total mess. We saw these overwhelmed, broken luggage carousels, just massive piles of lost bags. Why is that failure so insightful?
Because it exposes the sheer fragility of airport logistics. Airports are designed based on something called baggage throughput, basically how many bags can be processed per hour.
Okay.
When you had the post-pandemic surge in travel meet massive staffing shortages, the system was just immediately overloaded. The carousel, which is the final piece in that chain, couldn't handle the volume.
So that single failure, a conveyor belt just stopping?
That single failure illustrated the massive supply chain vulnerabilities that are inherent in high-volume travel. It shows you that this whole concept of global mobility depends on the flawless function of some very, very low-tech machinery.
So if the physical infrastructure is the carousel, then the temporal infrastructure that's governed by terms that come from military precision, estimated time of arrival, ETA, and estimated time of departure, ETD.
Yes, these are the logistical linchpins. ETA, the time you're likely to arrive, dictates so much more than just when you pick someone up from the airport.
It's critical for global supply chains.
Absolutely critical. When the Suez Canal was blocked in 2021 by the Ever Given, our sources highlighted that millions of shipping containers, carrying everything from medical components to consumer electronics, had their ETAs pushed back by weeks.
It was a global domino effect. A single blockage in one narrow canal forced a recalculation of ETAs for the entire world. It cost billions a day.
And then if you look at it through the migration lens, the meaning of ETA transforms completely. It stops being a logistical footnote, and it becomes a source of profound, almost existential hope.
How so?
Well, for refugees who have waited, sometimes for years, in temporary camps for resettlement, the ETA on a final flight manifest. That's the date their new life can actually start. It's quantifiable hope. A destination finally gets a timeline.
Wow. And conversely, ETD, this scheduled time for departure, that's all about synchronization. In high-end tourism, I'm thinking of places like the Port of Miami.
A perfect example. Smooth cruise ship port turnarounds, which are essential for the massive Caribbean tourism economy. They rely entirely on strictly managed ETDs. Every single minute a ship is delayed costs the operator revenue and disrupts the next vessel coming in.
But the ETD also forces us to confront some really uncomfortable ethical questions in migration policy.
It does. Our source touches on the use of ETDs for deportation flights. For example, in large-scale operations conducted by enforcement agencies. In that context, the departure time isn't the start of a vacation.
No.
It's a coercive deadline. It marks the end of a life that was established in a country.
And we saw this on a global scale in 2020. When the pandemic hit, flights were grounded everywhere, just erasing ETDs for millions of people.
Yes, and that showed how quickly these seemingly fixed logistical schedules can be just, invalidated by a global shock. It stranded tourists, business travelers, expatriates. The date you were supposed to leave just vanished.
It becomes a symbol of lost control. So before we leave the airport, there's one more piece. The human element of that seamless service. The valet. A professional service, parking and retrieving customers' cars.
Right. It promises security and convenience. The role itself comes from the French for attendant. And it really represents this layer of service that's essential to luxury tourism. I mean, in a mega resort in Las Vegas, valets might move thousands of high-value cars in a single night.
That demands incredible organizational skill.
And
Pressure.
huge pressure and accountability. But the migration link here, that reveals a deeper economic truth. The sources note that the valet position is often a critical entry-level role in the hospitality sector.
And it's frequently filled by immigrant workers.
Very frequently. For instance, you see a lot of Central American and Latin American workers in cities like Miami and Los Angeles in these roles. And think about it. It's incredibly high responsibility work. You're managing assets worth tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars.
For what is often low-wage work.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is the enormous amount of implicit trust that's involved. The whole system is built on the assumption that you, the customer, are just handing over your keys to a complete stranger who you assume is reliable and skilled.
Right. Our source had a funny but telling anecdote about this. The 2023 Hollywood Award show where a valet mix-up led to a minor celebrity car swap.
I remember that. And while it's funny, that incident just emphasizes how the system hinges entirely on the human attendant's precision and integrity. One single mistake, and you've breached the logistical chain and that essential bond of trust.
That's a perfect pivot. Thinking about that contrast between low-wage workers and high-value assets, well, let's move into part two, the business of hospitality. We're shifting from the airport logistics to accommodation and really focusing on the economic realities and cultural exchange.
And we have to start with the economic gatekeeper of that world, the rack rate.
The rack rate. It's the standard published price for a hotel room or a service before any discounts or negotiations. It's the baseline.
And the name is very literal. It comes from the historical practice of displaying the rates on a physical rack in the hotel lobby.
In this term, it seems simple, but it's crucial because it immediately flags economic disparity and dynamic pricing.
It does. The rack rate is almost always the highest possible price you can pay. Savvy travelers, as you know, they bypass it using online booking platforms. But people with institutional power, corporate relocation specialists, big conference organizers, they have the leverage to negotiate prices way below the rack rate, sometimes by 50% or more.
So who actually pays the rack rate? I mean, does anyone...
That's the key question. Primarily, it's the desperate, the uninformed, or the last-minute business traveler whose company policy limits their booking options. Our sources point to high-season destinations. Think of Paris during Fashion Week.
Or Davos during the World Economic Forum.
Exactly. In those moments, demand is what economists call inelastic. The hotel can, and does, demand the full rack rate, and it transforms a standard room into a luxury purchase just based on timing.
And this is where it gets really relevant for our listeners thinking about economic disparities. The post-pandemic price surges, fueled by inflation and limited supply, they've caused rack rates to just skyrocket.
They have. And this trend has actively priced out lower income or even just budget-conscious tourists from traditionally accessible cities. It reinforces this idea that high-end travel is a privilege that's increasingly confined to the wealthy. It's a mechanism that widens the travel gap.
Okay, moving on from that, we have this wonderfully evocative, almost archaic term, hostelry.
I love this word.
Me too. It's an elegant synonym for an inn or lodging, but it conveys this historical or quaint feeling. It comes from Old French, meaning a place for guests.
And it immediately connects you to the deep history of human movement. Before mass tourism, these places were vital infrastructure.
Absolutely. Historically, hostelries were medieval way stations. They were essential for pilgrims like those traveling the Camino de Santiago, or for long-distance traders. They were centers of community, of information exchange, and just necessary rest.
And for tourism today, tourists actively seek that out. They want that authenticity. Our source describes these converted historic hostelries in places like the Cotswolds in the UK.
Right, where visitors are basically consuming history, the architecture, even the local ghost stories, right along with their room and board.
Exactly. But the dual relevance here, linking travel and migration, is what's really critical. Our source detailed how during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, many of these traditional hostelries were repurposed as temporary shelters.
So they went back to their fundamental function.
They did, providing a bed and sustenance, but to deliver humanitarian aid.
That sounds like a necessary solution, but I have to ask, was it a seamless transition? I imagine that created some issues.
Oh, it was rarely seamless, and that's the nuance we need to get into. Historic buildings often lack the plumbing or the space needed for long-term residency. And beyond that, repurposing a hostelry in a small traditional town often sparks significant, very localized debates.
Debates about what?
About cultural integration, about resource allocation, about maintaining the town's character. So the debate isn't just about housing. It's about the clash of historical purpose with a modern urgent crisis.
That contrast brings us perfectly to a term that embodies the modern desire for conscious, sustainable travel, agritourism.
A great portmanteau. It's defined as a sustainable travel trend that blends agriculture and tourism. It involves staying with farmers, participating in farm activities.
This is where it gets really interesting for me, the idea of ethical consumption becoming something you can actually do.
It becomes tangible. Agritourism is a trend aimed at revitalizing struggling rural economies, particularly in areas that are heavily reliant on heritage or a specific product, like the vineyards of Napa Valley or the traditional cheese farms in Tuscany. It shortens the supply chain and gives direct income to the producer.
And the detailed experiences are what really elevate this. Our source provides great imagery, learning sustainable dairy practices while staying in a Swiss alpine chalet.
Or the hands-on experience of picking lavender in Provence and then attending a cooking class using that farm's own ingredients.
Yeah.
It's participatory learning, not passive viewing.
And that participation, I imagine, fosters a real environmental awareness. You see firsthand the challenges of sustainable food production.
It does. However, and this is important, we have to apply critical thinking. While the intention is sustainable, the practice can be vulnerable to over-tourism.
Right.
The source noted specific Italian regions where the influx of visitors, all demanding this authentic experience, has caused demonstrable resource strain. They specifically cited accelerated soil erosion in some very popular vineyard agritourism spots.
So the pursuit of authenticity can actually end up destroying the very resource it's trying to protect.
Exactly. It's a very delicate balance. It requires robust management and, frankly, regulation.
Okay, our final term in this consumer section is the pejorative label, tourist trap, a place that exists pretty much solely to exploit a visitor's naivety by overcharging or offering really low-quality goods or experiences.
This term really took off during the mass tourism boom in the mid-20th century. And the classic examples are universally recognized. Times Square, for instance, where the flashy billboards disguise the fact that the food and souvenirs are wildly overpriced.
Or the trinket stalls right by the Eiffel Tower. They exist to maximize immediate profit from people who are just passing through.
Right. But the metaphor expands profoundly when we connect it to migration.
Yeah.
We're talking about more than just a bad lunch.
Right.
A newly arrived immigrant in a dense urban center, say Bangkok or Mexico City, they often lack the essential localized knowledge. Where to get the best exchange rate, which bus line is legitimate, which neighborhood service isn't a scam.
So they fall victim to what are functionally tourist traps of urban exploitation.
Exactly. Overcharged rent, predatory lending, subpar, expensive necessities. They learn these difficult, expensive lessons about urban commerce and survival that locals just inherently know.
And that links to policy, because cities are actively fighting this perception. The source mentions Venice's explicit efforts to crack down on low-quality, exploitative sites with fines and regulations.
And Venice recognizes that these tourist traps erode the authentic cultural integrity the city is trying to preserve. Ultimately, it devalues the destination for everyone. The tourist trap damages the city's brand as much as it damages the wallet of the person being exploited.
That sets a strong baseline on the economics of voluntary travel. Now, though, we have to pivot. We're moving into part 3. The vocabulary of forced mobility and exile. This section requires us to focus on international law, legal status, and the often painful realities of displacement.
And we begin with a term of immense consequence. It's a fundamental tool of state control, deportation. Defined as the official expulsion of a non-citizen from a country, usually for violating laws or for being deemed undesirable. It comes from the Latin deportere, to carry away.
Okay, let's unpack the real-life weight of this. Deportation doesn't just disrupt an individual, it rips apart families, entire communities, and we have to report impartially on the scale of these actions. Our sources referenced, for example, U.S. deportations under various administrations, highlighting the massive logistical operation and the profound disruption caused by policy shifts like the 2018 family separations.
And this policy tool is used globally. Post-Brexit, the UK initiated deportations of EU citizens who hadn't secured settled status. It illustrates how a legal status that was once stable can be revoked almost overnight because of a political change. The sources also cite the tragic financial and psychological costs of deporting Rohingya refugees from India back to a country where they fear persecution.
That raises a critical question. When does deportation, which is a legal act of state control, when does that cross the line and become an illegal act against humanity?
And then that brings us to our next term, which is absolutely crucial in international law.
Refoulement. This is the critical distinction.
Refoulement is defined as the illegal practice of forcing asylum seekers or refugees back to a territory where they face a threat to their life or freedom. It violates the core principle of the 1951 Refugee Convention.
I really want to stress that distinction. Deportation is a state exercising its legal right to remove a non-citizen. Refoulement, from the French refouler, meaning to drive back, is a fundamental violation of international refugee law.
And it's strictly non-derogable, which is a legal term meaning no state can claim national security allows them to send a person back to face death or torture. There are no exceptions.
So it represents this brutal tension between a state's need for border security and an individual's fundamental human right to safety.
Precisely. And allegations of refoulement are constant in regions with high migration pressure. Our sources detail the 2023 global scrutiny following reports of expedited removal processes at the U.S.-Mexico border. And there's historical precedent, too, during the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, where many nations were accused of driving refugees back into danger zones.
And the current situation, with Afghan refugees being forced back from Pakistan despite fleeing conflict and upheaval, that's a textbook, tragic example of this violation happening right now.
It is. It demonstrates that refoulement is not some theoretical concept. It's an active policy failure that puts millions of people at risk. Documenting and prosecuting acts of refoulement is one of the most vital functions of human rights organizations globally.
Now let's move to a crucial distinction that helps us understand the sheer scale of modern crises. The internally displaced person, or IDP.
Right. An IDP is someone who's been forced to flee their home, but remains within their country's international borders, usually because of conflict, disaster, or violence.
The term gained prominence during the Balkan Wars in the 90s, I believe.
It did, in UN frameworks. And the distinction from a refugee is critical. A refugee has crossed an international border and is therefore protected by the 1951 Refugee Convention. An IDP has not crossed a border and therefore doesn't have that same legal protection from the international community.
So because they haven't crossed a border, they often become invisible to global aid mechanisms.
Precisely. They're trapped within these precarious internal political situations. And the scale is immense. Our sources highlight that in Syria's civil war, IDPs consistently outnumbered refugees. It shows that internal displacement is often the more common reality in conflict zones, and it strains local resources far beyond their capacity.
And in Ukraine, after the 2022 invasion, millions became IDPs, creating these massive internal crises in the cities and towns they fled to.
And here's the profound connection to climate change. Our source cites Bangladesh, where annual monsoon floods create hundreds of thousands of IDPs every year. Climate change is a force multiplier, repeatedly displacing people who remain within their borders but lose everything: their stability, their livelihoods, their access to basic services. The IDP is fast becoming the face of climate crisis mobility.
Moving on, we have the politically and historically charged term émigré and its feminine form, émigré.
Yes, both denote an individual who has left their native country to settle elsewhere because of political reasons, war, or upheaval. Crucially, they carry this connotation of political exile, and often a sort of high culture loss. The term stems notably from the French Revolution.
And these terms really capture the immense loss of talent, the brain drain that follows a political collapse. You think of figures who fled persecution and then went on to profoundly contribute to their new homelands. Albert Einstein, a famous émigré from Nazi Germany, is the prime example.
And the world gained immeasurably from their forced relocation. The contemporary relevance is just as striking. Think of the massive flow of Venezuelan émigrés fleeing economic and political collapse into Colombia and other countries. They're building new lives while also sending remittances home, trying to sustain the people they left behind.
Or the wave of Russian émigrés after the 1917 revolution, who enriched cultural centers like Paris and Berlin.
Exactly. And the source makes a strong point about the feminine form, émigré. And it's important to ask why that distinction matters.
So why does
it highlights the unique gender-based challenges that are inherent in exile. Women in exodus often face higher vulnerability to trafficking, greater difficulty accessing documentation, and specific legal constraints. Our sources reference Afghan women post-2021 whose fundamental rights were just curtailed, forcing them into émigré status.
But it also celebrates the enormous cultural contributions of women in exile.
Enormous. People like Marie Curie, a Polish émigré who became a scientific icon in France. The experience of exile is profoundly gendered, and the language should reflect that.
Our final term in this section on displacement contrasts strongly with exile, the repatriate.
Yes, a person who has returned to their home country after living abroad, often voluntarily. It signifies the end of a long journey. The word comes from Latin, to return to one's country.
And repatriation can require massive logistical planning by governments.
Huge. We saw this with India's Vande Bharat missions in 2020. It was one of the largest operations ever conducted to bring citizens who were stranded abroad during the pandemic lockdowns back home. Similarly, post-World War II, the return of Jewish communities to Europe involved these incredibly complex systems of support and transport.
But the crucial challenge here, the so what moment for the individual, is reverse culture shock. People assume returning home is the easy part.
But our source details how incredibly difficult it is. The country you left has changed, and you, the repatriate, have changed even more profoundly because of your time abroad.
The psychological and logistical struggle must be immense.
It is. Our source gives a very relatable example. American repatriates struggling intensely with the complexities and high costs of the U.S. healthcare system after spending years in countries with socialized medical care.
Right.
And beyond healthcare, there's the challenge of re-entering the job market, adapting to a different social pace, rebuilding old friendships that might have lapsed. The homecoming is often just the start of another difficult process of readaptation.
We've covered the places, the pricing, the people. Okay, let's wrap up our deep dive with part 4. The verbs of movement, disruption, and legal change. These are the action words that determine if movement is voluntary, coerced, or, well, catastrophic.
We begin with a verb that's central to the migrant success story: to naturalize. This means to grant citizenship to a foreigner through defined legal processes. Usually it involves residency requirements, interviews, and taking an oath of allegiance. It's the highest legal goal for many newcomers.
And this act is so deeply symbolic. For generations, it's been associated with the American dream. You think of those famous ceremonies at Ellis Island. For many migrants, to naturalize provides the ultimate security. full legal rights, voting power, and protection from the threat of deportation.
But the verb also sits right at the center of a huge policy debate about global equity. We have to look closely at the global trend of golden visas.
Right. This is where countries like Portugal, Malta, Cyprus, they'll effectively naturalize wealthy investors.
Exactly. People who purchase real estate or invest significant capital in exchange for residency or citizenship.
This essentially commodifies citizenship, doesn't it?
It raises profound questions about equity. Is citizenship a reward you earn through civic engagement and long-term residency? Or is it a commodity that's just available to the highest bidder? The source points out these golden visa programs also introduce security screening risks and can distort local real estate markets, making housing unaffordable for long-term residents.
So the act of naturalizing a new citizen through wealth is far more complex than the traditional route.
Much more complex. And juxtaposed against that voluntary process is this coercive, powerful verb to expatriate. This specifically means to banish or force an individual to live in another country as a punishment or political necessity. It is completely distinct from choosing to be an expatriate.
This is a devastating declaration of non-belonging. It's imposed by the state.
Yes. Historically, ancient Rome would expatriate its enemies as a form of non-lethal political punishment. In a modern context, we've seen governments like Saudi Arabia expatriate or revoke the citizenship of political critics or dissidents to neutralize their influence at home and ensure they can never return.
The severity of that is immense. It's permanent political deportation. I mean, while Edward Snowden's flight was self-imposed exile, the idea of being perpetually unable to return home because of a state decree, that is the essence of this term.
It is. And it also raises ethical issues about detainees who are effectively expatriated to places like Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention. It is the ultimate statement of state control over where a person is allowed to exist.
Now let's look at two practical verbs of mobility that contrast routine with necessity: to ply and to detour.
Great pairing. To ply means to travel along a specific, regular, defined path, often for trade or transport. It evokes routine journeys.
Like delivery trucks plying the highway every day, or those Mediterranean cruise ships that are constantly plying the same routes between major ports like Venice and Barcelona.
Exactly. Now, to detour, by contrast, means to take a roundabout way because the direct route is blocked, or unavailable, or just less desirable. In the tourism context, a detour is often a choice you make for enjoyment.
Right, the scenic drive into Yosemite to see a vista, or a cyclist choosing a specific path through a park to avoid traffic.
But the critical application connects these two verbs to the painful side of migration. Human traffickers tragically ply dangerous but regular paths across vast regions like the Sahara Desert. These routes are routine, well-established business lines of exploitation.
And at the same time, migrants and refugees are frequently forced to detour around reinforced borders. They take the dangerous Balkan route or cross treacherous waters, specifically to avoid detection and certain refoulement.
Their deviation is a necessity for survival. It contrasts so sharply with the tourist's choice for pleasure.
And as we mentioned earlier, climate events are forcing more and more detours. Flooded highways in Australia, severe storms forcing ships to change course. These are real-world examples of how nature itself compels us to deviate from our routine paths.
We're moving toward the end of the journey now with two specialized verbs of disembarkation: to deplane and to detrain. Aviation and rail-specific terms for leaving the vehicle.
They sound so technical, so logistical, but they carry this profound emotional weight. In tourism, to deplane in an exotic place like Bali marks the instantaneous start of an adventure. It's full of joy, excitement, anticipation.
And conversely, for a refugee, to deplane at a European airport might signify the beginning of an entirely new, incredibly difficult asylum process. A Syrian family arriving in Germany, for example, the same physical act, stepping onto the tarmac, triggers radically different emotional and crucially legal realities.
Logistically, to detrain efficiency is a global marker of infrastructure success. I mean, you think of this seamless, rapid detraining process in Japan's Shinkansen rail system.
Right, but in Europe's Schengen area, detraining at a station near a border can involve complex identity checks and security protocols.
And that's before you even factor in global health crises. During the pandemic, the simple acts of deplaning or detraining were transformed by mandatory thermal screening, health declarations, secondary security interviews. These simple verbs suddenly encompassed a whole host of complex procedures. Our final term is to derail. Literally, a train accident where the vehicle goes off the tracks. Metaphorically, it means to suddenly and severely disrupt plans or progress.
And we have to always remember the literal tragic weight of this word. Our source detailed the 2013 Lac-Mégantic derailment in Canada. It was a catastrophic event where hazardous materials exploded and it devastated an entire community, leading to a mass loss of life. That physical image of monumental disruption is what gives the metaphor its power.
And the metaphorical use is just pervasive in global mobility narratives. We describe refugees' disrupted or derailed life plans when their boats capsize in the Mediterranean, or when a political crisis suddenly ends their career. Their momentum is just catastrophically halted.
And even in voluntary travel, a major derailment in, say, the Indian rail network can throw national logistics into chaos, delaying scenic tours and crippling local services for days. It is the verb of sudden, destructive interruption.
Wow. We started with a very specific, the engineering of the luggage carousel and the economics of the rack rate, and we ended with terms of just such high consequence, like refoulement, the illegal expulsion of those seeking safety, and the catastrophic impact of something being derailed.
By really examining these C2 level terms, you, our listener, are now equipped to navigate these global narratives with a profound new nuance. This vocabulary bridges cultural understanding and it fosters empathy because it gives a precise name to these very complex human experiences, whether they involve voluntary travel or forced displacement. We've shown these words aren't just definitions, they are analytical tools.
And that interconnectedness, that's the deep systemic takeaway here. We've seen how tourism and migration rely on the exact same infrastructure and use the same verbs, like to ply, to describe their routine paths, even when one path is driven by pleasure and the other is driven by absolute necessity.
So consider this as a final provocative thought. We've explored the rise and challenges of ethical, sustainable travel initiatives like agritourism. These fundamentally rely on open borders, local infrastructure, and cultural preservation. They promote positive, ethical movement and integration.
Right.
So how might the global visibility and the measurable success of these ethical travel models, which depend on free and ethical movement, how might that influence public opinion and subsequently shift the political debates that surround border integrity and the difficult ethics of coercive actions like refoulement?
It's a subtle connection, but it highlights how the choices we make when we travel can have these broad, profound implications for human rights and for mobility everywhere.